4,750. That is the number of B-17 bombers lost in combat during World War II. The aircraft was a wall of heavy machine guns and steel plating. It earned the name Flying Fortress, but the title came at a lethal cost. These bombers suffered one of the highest attrition rates in military history. Each plane carried a crew of 10 men. When one plane fell, 10 lives vanished. The math of the air war was brutal. How dangerous was a seat on a B-17? At first glance, it was the pinnacle of technology, but in reality, it was a metal trap at 30,000 feet. Modern warfare changed after 1918. The slaughter of trench warfare forced every global power to rethink strategy. Military leaders looked away from the mud and toward the sky. They needed a weapon to bypass the front lines entirely. The heavy bomber became the solution. Strategists believed these machines could fly over defenses, destroy factories, and end wars in weeks. By 1934, the United States Air Corps moved to modernize. They wanted to scrap old fabric-covered biplanes. The goal was a long-range, all-metal heavy hitter. The requirements were specific. The plane had to fly at 250 miles per hour. It had to reach 10,000 feet and cover 2,000 miles on a single tank of fuel. The government issued a challenge to private companies. There was one condition. The companies had to fund their own prototypes. The winner would receive a contract for 220 aircraft. Boeing was nearly bankrupt. The company was bleeding cash and running out of time. Despite the risk, they took a total gamble. Engineers poured every remaining dollar into a single design. They called it the Model 299. It featured 4 engines and a sleek aluminum skin. It did not just meet the Air Corps requirements, it exceeded them in every category. The footage from the first test flight shows a massive 4-engine giant lifting off the tarmac. This was the birth of the Flying Fortress. But this was only the beginning. Events accelerated quickly. Boeing had the superior machine, but the cost of production was staggering. The company had bet its entire existence on a single airframe. One mistake during testing would end the company forever. The pilots climbed into the cockpit and felt the weight of the gamble. The engines roared. The sound of 4 Wright Cyclone engines drowned out all conversation. There was no turning back. 1935. A journalist views the rows of machine guns bristling from the fuselage. He calls it a flying fortress. The name sticks, but the reality is far from invulnerable. Why did the world's most famous bomber almost never fly? The answer lies in a heap of burning wreckage. During the initial competition, Boeing's prototype stalled and slammed into the ground seconds after takeoff. 2 pilots died. The disaster disqualified Boeing immediately. The military rejected the design and gave the contract to the Douglas DB-1. The Air Corps ordered 133 Douglas bombers. Boeing was finished. At first glance, a total failure, but in reality, a temporary setback. The military bought only 13 test models, designated as YB-17S. Boeing engineers worked in the background, refining the engines and airframe. They built only 10 early production units. No one predicted the scale of the coming conflict. Then came September 1939. Europe was at war. Tensions in the Pacific reached a breaking point. The United States watched the maps and realized the Douglas bombers were too slow and too weak. Boeing's B-17 was the only heavy bomber ready for combat, but the inventory was tiny. Only 30 planes existed. The government opened the vaults. Boeing received unlimited funding to ramp up production immediately. Engineers added more turrets and thicker glass. They were preparing for a war that was already at the doorstep. But this was only the beginning. 20 B-17S were sent to the British Royal Air Force. Disaster followed them across the Atlantic. One plane suffered a total power failure and crashed during the ferry flight. It was a dark omen. The situation turned fatal during the first combat mission. The British sent a group of B-17S to strike a German shipbuilding center. The mission was a catastrophe. At high altitudes, the temperature plummeted. The grease in the machine guns thickened and froze. The weapons were useless. The footage from the era shows the results. Bombs fell miles away from the target. German fighters intercepted the formation. These early B-17s had no tail gunners. They were defenseless from the rear. Most of their guns were light 30 caliber models, which lacked the range and punch of the heavier 50 caliber rounds. The Luftwaffe pilots were the most experienced in the sky. They tore the bombers apart. The early B-17s lacked armor plating around the engines and cockpits. German Flak exploded in the air. Shrapnel ripped through the thin aluminum skin like paper. It severed oil lines and fuel pipes. It shredded the crews inside their seats. There was no mistake. The design was flawed. The Allies were learning through blood. Inexperience and weak tactics led to horrifying casualty rates. Every mission meant more empty hangars. The flying fortress was a myth that cost hundreds of lives to turn into a reality. Events accelerated, the losses mounted. The story of the B-17 had begun with a crash, and now it was continuing in a graveyard. Failure was immediate. Because of these losses, the British military pulled the B-17 from European service entirely. They deemed the aircraft too vulnerable for daylight operations. The Americans took a different path. They deployed the bombers to the Pacific as tensions with Japan reached a breaking point, December 7, 1941. At Pearl Harbor, 12 B-17s sat parked on the tarmac. Japanese fighters caught them in the open. All 12 were destroyed before they could even start their engines. This was the beginning. Soon, the B-17 took on reconnaissance roles across the Pacific. It dropped its first payloads on a Japanese naval convoy. But the real trial waited in the West. In Europe, the Flying Fortress would fly missions that remain the deadliest in aviation history. American command identified a clear objective. To stop the German war machine, they had to destroy its heart. They established the 8th Air Force in England. A joint campaign with the British Royal Air Force began. The plan was simple on paper. Fly across the English Channel, target German-occupied territory, destroy oil refineries, U-boat pens, and aircraft factories. But the strategy expanded. The Allies turned to terror bombing. This meant targeting civilian towns and cities directly. The goal was to shatter German morale and break the population's will to resist. Commanders believed this would force an unconditional surrender and end the war early. The Germans did not collapse. Instead, they fought back with intense flak and interceptor wings. The British had already learned a lesson in blood. Daylight bombing was a suicide mission. They switched to night raids. This meant sacrificing precision, but it reduced the risk from enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Why did the Americans refuse to hide in the dark? They believed in two things. First, tight defensive formations. Second, the power of 12.50 caliber machine guns bristling from every bomber. They also bet everything on the Norden bomb sight. This was a highly guarded secret. It used a primitive computer to calculate exactly where a bomb would fall. During the final run, the bombardier used an early autopilot system to steer the entire heavy bomber through the site itself. In theory, this was surgical. In reality, it was a failure. Statistics show that 80% of early war bombs missed their targets completely. Smoke, wind, and pilot nerves ruined the math. The Allies were now bombing Germany around the clock, but the cost was rising. Daylight missions suffered catastrophic losses. The casualty rates were so high that High Command nearly canceled the entire program multiple times. The footage shows empty hangars and charred wreckage. The sound of sirens became constant. Why did so many B-17 crews die? At first glance, they had the best technology in the world. But in reality, they were flying into a meat grinder. Events accelerated. The sky over Germany became a graveyard of aluminum and silk. There was no turning back. 26,000 American airmen died. The high casualty rate came down to three specific factors. Two of those factors involved German defensive evolution. At the start of the campaign, the strategy was simple. B-17 flying fortresses would fly deep into Germany without long-range fighter escorts. Military planners believed the bombers' own guns were enough. There was also a technical limit. Early fighters lacked the fuel capacity for long-distance missions. They could only protect the bombers for the first few hundred miles. Then, they reached their range limit. The fighters peeled off and headed home. This left the bombers alone. They were vulnerable deep over enemy territory. Long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang eventually arrived. The situation improved. But by then, the losses were already catastrophic. The Germans adapted with speed and precision. They didn't just fly, they re-engineered. They packed their fighters with heavier cannons and armor. They changed their tactics specifically to dismantle bomber formations. Pilots practiced coordinated slashing runs. They perfected head-on attacks to exploit the B-17's nose vulnerabilities. By the end of the war, they deployed air-to-air rockets in the world's first jet fighter, the Me-262. Why was the tail gunner so critical? Engineers added tail turrets, dorsal turrets, and more 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns to the B-17. The tail position became the most effective defensive post on the plane. It was a stable firing platform. Unlike waist gunners, the tail gunner didn't have to calculate complex lead angles. They fired twin 50s directly at attackers approaching from the rear. Accuracy increased. Because of this, the tail gunner carried the largest supply of ammunition on the aircraft, but fighters were only half the nightmare. The other half came from anti-aircraft artillery. This was flak. The standard 88mm cannon was the primary tool. It fired a shell weighing nearly 10 kilograms at high velocity. The shell could reach the highest bomber formations with ease. How did the shells work? German batteries used timed fuses. They set the shells to explode at the exact altitude of the bombers. One explosion sent thousands of high-velocity fragments into the air. These jagged metal shards shredded the thin aluminum skin of the B-17. They severed fuel lines. They cut through hydraulic control runs. They caused physical trauma to the crew that defies description. The technology was sophisticated. The Germans used the Kommandogürät fire control analog computer. They paired it with 4-meter optical rangefinders. Later, they integrated Würzburg radar data. These analog systems calculated range, speed, and altitude in real time. The computer determined the elevation and azimuth for every gun in the battery. Electrical cables fed this data directly to the crews. The result was a coordinated system. A battery of 4 or more 88mm guns could fill a specific patch of sky with timed bursts. The bombers had to fly through this wall of steel. Was it an easy shot? No. It was a mathematical struggle. To score a hit, the German crews had to get every calculation right. They used primitive dials and gears while the target moved at hundreds of miles per hour. A single shell needed 20 to 30 seconds of flight time to reach its target. The footage shows the results. Black clouds of smoke filling the sky, planes falling in pieces. The air war over Europe was a meat grinder. 30 seconds. That was the window. Every half minute, the bomber formations shifted their course or adjusted their altitude. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate tactic to ruin the flak gunner's aim. Even a perfect calculation on the ground ended in a miss. The sky remained empty because the bombers refused to fly a straight line, but the Germans adapted. They deployed advanced radar systems and streamlined their fire control data. The Allies responded immediately. They began using electronic countermeasures and radar jamming. It became a technical duel between engineers on both sides. The cycle of escalation continued. Germany refined their radar integration. The Allies dropped chaff, thousands of strips of aluminum foil, to clutter German screens. They used noise jamming to drown out signals. It was a constant game of cat and mouse played at 30,000 feet. Then came the bomb run. In these moments, all evasion stopped. To hit a target on the ground, the formation had to fly straight. They had to maintain a level altitude for several minutes. The bombers became sitting ducks. The Germans changed their strategy again. They stopped focusing on precise aiming. Instead, they relied on volume. They saturated specific sectors of the sky with high explosive shells. The goal was simple: fill the air with enough metal that a hit became a statistical certainty. The footage from the era shows the result. Black puffs of smoke surround the planes. The aircraft moved through a wall of shrapnel. For the men inside, the experience was purely random. There was no skill involved in surviving a flak field. They could only sit in their stations and wait. 10 men lived inside each B-17. 4 were officers: the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier. The remaining 6 were enlisted crew. These men served as gunners, though some also managed the radio or maintained the engines. The B-17G was the definitive version of the aircraft. It was the most produced model of the war. For defense, it carried 13 50 caliber machine guns. These weapons pointed in every direction, covering every possible angle of attack. It was a flying fortress, but against the flak, the guns were useless. Beneath the fuselage hung the ball turret. It was a plexiglass sphere measuring only 4 feet in diameter. Inside, space was so limited that the gunner could not wear a parachute. The gear stayed in the main cabin. In an emergency, the gunner faced a lethal process. He had to rotate the turret manually to align 2 small hatches. Then, he needed a crewmate to pull him into the fuselage. Only after securing his harness could he jump. In a burning or spiraling aircraft, these steps were nearly impossible. Why was this position the most hated? The answer is simple. German pilots targeted the ball turret first. They knew its twin guns were the most dangerous threat to their fighters. The reality of the job was documented in a famous wartime poem. The author described a grim end. The gunner was eventually washed out of the turret with a high-pressure hose. This was not a literary device. It was a literal fact of aerial warfare. The damage was visible and graphic. One direct hit from a 30mm cannon or a burst of flak disintegrated the human frame. Ground crews often found only fragments of the gunner remaining in the plexiglass ball. Surviving airmen returned to base with permanent psychological scars. They had seen their friends reduced to a state that no official report could describe. Statistically, the waist gunners faced the highest risk of being hit. They operated 50 caliber machine guns through open rectangular gaps in the fuselage. There was no armor. Only freezing wind separated the gunners from incoming rounds. Later models featured plexiglass windows to block the draft, but the protection was minimal. The environment inside the B-17 was brutal. The cabins were unpressurized. At 25,000 feet, the air contains almost no oxygen. If a mask failed, the gunner lost consciousness in less than 60 seconds. The temperature dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. To survive, the men wore heavy suits heated by electric coils. These suits were unreliable. They either froze or burned the wearer's skin. Physical contact was a hazard. Touching bare metal with a naked hand resulted in instant bonding. The skin would tear off upon removal. Frostbite was a constant threat, often causing the loss of fingers and toes. If the main oxygen system failed, the men relied on walk-around bottles. These small cylinders provided just enough air to reach lower altitudes. Was bailing out a viable escape? In reality, it was a desperate gamble. Estimates suggest only 1 in 4 crewmen who jumped over enemy territory survived the war. The rest died in the air or during the fall. The bomber had several exits: the nose hatch, the bomb bay, the waist doors, and the tail. But a spinning plane created massive G-forces. Doors jammed, fire blocked the paths. The equipment was the final hurdle. As noted, the ball turret gunner had no parachute on his person. The tail gunner's parachute hung on a wall behind him. In a tight spin, reaching that wall was physically impossible. Many men fell from the sky without any parachute at all. The equipment was either destroyed by flak or rendered unreachable by the centrifugal force of the crash. Thus ended their service. February 1944. The crews called it Big Week. In just 7 days, 244 bombers vanished from the sky. 33 escort fighters went down with them. The toll was absolute. 2,600 men were killed, wounded, or captured in a single week of operations. Some men made a final choice. When the engines turned into blowtorches, they didn't reach for a parachute. They jumped into the open air. They preferred the impact of the ground to the heat of the cockpit. It wasn't a suicide. It was an escape from the fire. The cost was massive, but the result was a shift in the war. These raids broke the Luftwaffe. They destroyed German fuel refineries. The German army began to starve for oil. On the ground, tankers were forced to blow up their own Tiger tanks. There was no fuel to move them. There were no spare parts to fix them. The bombing campaign stripped the gears of the German war machine. Was the campaign effective? Experts believe these missions shortened the war by 1 full year. But the price was measured in blood. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died in the ruins below. Tens of thousands of airmen never returned to their bases. But the enemy wasn't the only killer. Formation flying was a lethal science. For many pilots, the hardest part of the mission wasn't the target, it was the takeoff. Every 30 seconds, a bomber roared down the runway. One plane was still lifting off while the next was already at full throttle behind it. The goal was the combat box, 18 planes in a tight V shape. Later, this grew to 36 bombers. They had to assemble in the English weather, heavy fog, low clouds, zero visibility. In the gray mist, giant bombers collided, metal sheared metal, engines cut through fuselages. Training was a death trap. Statistics proved the danger. 5,000 crewmen died in accidents within the United States. They never saw the English coast. They never saw a German fighter. They died in cornfields and training strips before their war even began. Safety was found in the group. If a B-17 left the formation, it died. Post-war studies confirmed it. Half of all bombers shot down were stragglers. Some pilots broke formation out of fear. Most were forced out. Heavy flak shattered their engines. Mechanical failures slowed them down. Once a plane lagged behind, German fighters swarmed. The formation created a wall of lead. Overlapping machine guns covered every angle. But density brought its own risks. One flak shell could damage 3 planes at once. A crippled bomber could spiral out of control and take out its wingman. The chaos inside the box was total. Hundreds of guns fired at once. The footage shows tracers crisscrossing the sky. Friendly fire was a constant threat. Safety switches were designed to stop guns from hitting their own tail fins. But in a crowded formation, other bombers were everywhere. Gunners accidentally sprayed the planes next to them. Switches failed, parts broke. Control was an illusion. Survival was a matter of inches and seconds. Then, the missions became even more dangerous. The command ordered the daylight raids, March 6, 1944. This date marked the first major daylight raid on the capital of the Third Reich. Berlin was a fortress. It was the most heavily defended city in Germany. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns ringed the perimeter. Massive concrete flak towers stood in every sector. These structures were designed to withstand direct hits from 500-pound bombs. The German military committed every available resource to the city's defense. Why was the mission so dangerous? Berlin was the heart of the regime, but for the 8th Air Force it became a graveyard. On that single day in March, the Americans lost 69 bombers. This remains the highest one-day loss in the history of the 8th Air Force. The sky was filled with smoke and falling metal. But the bombers fought back. They destroyed 160 German fighter planes. Large sections of Berlin were left burning. The footage shows black smoke rising thousands of feet into the air. At first glance, a standard air war. But in reality, a descent into madness. The situation turned desperate. By the final years of the war, the Luftwaffe formed special ramming units. Pilots received orders to use their planes as weapons. If they ran out of ammunition, they did not retreat. They steered their fighters directly into the B-17S. It was a German version of the kamikaze tactic. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed over the clouds. These suicidal collisions became common during the final year of the war. The German front was collapsing. Desperation replaced strategy. Events accelerated. The crews of the flying fortresses fought a war of attrition. Throughout the conflict, they fired over 90 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The spent casings fell like rain over the European continent. These gunners shot down more than 18,000 German aircraft. B-17S dropped approximately 500,000 tons of explosives. This accounted for 1/3 of the total Allied bomb tonnage dropped on Europe. But this came at a terrible price. Numbers tell the real story. 250,000 men flew in B-17S during the war. More than 46,000 of them were killed, wounded, or taken as prisoners of war. In the frame, empty barracks and letters sent home to grieving families. Few other jobs in human history have carried such a high risk of death. The statistics were absolute. Out of every 5 men, 1 did not return. The mission ended there.